Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo.
I guess one of the problems that many people who object to Roe v. Wade decision of the Supreme Court in 1973 is that it really doesn't protect the rights of the fetal life at all. You could say, well, that law is, sort of a minimal thing, and it doesn't really look at the whole moral situation and so on. And I agree with that. But the problem, from one aspect, is that it doesn't do enough for the unborn life. It doesn't in any way protect that. So that the pro-life people are on that side of the question. They're saying, but yes, what about the rights of the fetus? And how won't our culture sort of go downhill if we simply are aborting people right and left?
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Bruce Kramer, a lawyer practicing in the city of Toledo. Today's Reflections focuses on the topic of the legal aspects of the abortion question. Here's Father Bacik.
Bruce, you and I have been friends for a long time. I've always enjoyed our conversations. You're a man who likes to talk about serious matters, although you have a marvelous sense of humor to go with all of that. But you have a side that likes to sit down and talk about the things that count and so on. And I would like to prevail upon you to speak a little bit about the whole question of the abortion situation in the United States, and to do it somewhat from a legal point of view. I know that all of us in our professions have our own expertise. I'm a theologian, but there's so many areas of theology that I really don't know or simply dabble in, and I know that this isn't really your field as a lawyer, constitutional kind of law, but I wonder if we can't talk about it anyway.
I think as friends we can talk about it, and certainly to share some thoughts in that regard. And I'm still searching for my area of specialty and knowledge in the law in any event, so
well,
no need to worry about it.
Well, we might find out here that you indeed do like this area. Bruce, we go back to this whole situation, I suppose, just to set it historically a little bit. In my understanding of it is that the states, for a long time, did this business of legislating in the area of abortion, and that it was only in the 60s, really, that this began to become a problem. It seems to me one of the legal associations in 1959 made a statement about abortion that began to spark a little bit of debate. And as we went into the 60s, my recollection is that a lot of people started to say, well, we have to be careful of the therapeutic situation. We have to remember to protect the health and well-being of mothers, and therefore we need to begin to talk about opening up the law so that we can protect the mother's health and so on. So there was a lot of talk in the 60s about therapeutic abortions. And then as we went on from there, it seems as though the pro-abortion people began to move in a bolder kind of direction. So they began to talk about abortion on demand, or women's rights over their own bodies. And the rallying cry, of course, became then to get rid of all laws that would restrict abortions. And then that set the stage, I think, as I see it at least, for the famous Roe v. Wade decision by the Supreme Court, which was given in January 22nd, 1973, so really are celebrating the anniversary of that particular decision around this time. And by a 7-2 decision, they decided that on the basis of the right of privacy, which is founded on the 14th Amendment, that a woman really does therefore have the right to terminate her pregnancy. And the court really didn't speculate on the question of whether the fetus is a person or not, although many people who look at that decision claim that they have done that because they haven't recognized the rights of fetal life. But they ended up saying that really that the states could not make laws to prevent abortions in the first trimester of the pregnancy, the first 3 months. And then for the next trimester, they said that the state may regulate the abortion procedure in ways reasonably related to maternal health. So when it came in the second trimester, we had this business of the maternal health. that the states could make laws based on that, and that after viability, the states would have the right to proscribe abortion. That is to say that abortion really could not be had. They would be doing that because they were trying to promote the interests of the potentiality of human life that they would find in the fetal life. So I guess there were other things that they said, but that's generally the way I understand the law that we now live under. So that it's this court is saying that the states in the first trimester cannot forbid abortions, and in the second 3-month period that certain laws based on the maternal health situation could be made, and that in the final trimester that states indeed could make laws to forbid abortions. And I think that's the law of the land that we currently have.
Which smacks very much of a conversation that you and I had recently about meeting minimum expectations of the law vis-a-vis establishing ideals to guide ourselves by. And I think that the Roe versus Wade kind of decision is very much a legalistic minimum sort of focus, instead of trying to say something, as hopefully the legislatures might in the not-too-distant future, about this is the kind of ideal that we might be guided by, that we might try to follow, and not try to get into some legalistic thing that it just sort of, I think in a lot of minds' eyes, it doesn't quite feel right to say that, well, during the first 3 months you can do this, and during the next 3 months you can do that, and so on. And I think that we've all heard of that line of thought that follows on that says, well, if you're over 65 but under 70, we got to be a little bit careful of you, but between 70 and 75 we can do pretty much whatever we want, and it's from 75 and after we'll just take you out in the field and gun you down. I mean, it's that sort of mentality that seems to set up stages where there is more, there is a greater or a lesser concern about the individual involved.
I guess one of the problems that many people who object to Roe versus Wade decision of the Supreme Court in 1973 is that it really doesn't protect the rights of the fetal life at all. The controversy, as we find in our country today, I think, revolves around those phrases that are often used: pro-choice and pro-life. And, the pro-choice people working out, I think, of a sort of Enlightenment ideal of individual freedom, the traditional liberal position that individuals have to have maximum freedom and so on, has really based their whole argument on saying that a woman in our society has to have the right to her own body, the right to deal with this fetal life growing within her, and that we must protect that kind of right. All the literature you see that comes out on that side simply keeps saying we can't have an intolerant society, we can't have a group of people imposing on the rest of us their own morality, we have to maximize freedom and so on. And I think what people are saying on the other side are saying that, well, wait a second, what about the rights of the unborn life? So that Roe versus Wade doesn't seem to do much for them. It doesn't protect them in any way. It doesn't guarantee them their own rights. And of course, then that raises the question, as you suggest, about, well, what about the fetal life? Is that really a person or not? Can we describe the unborn child as a person? But what I'm saying right here is that you could say, well, that law is, sort of a minimal thing, and it doesn't really look at the whole moral situation and so on. And I agree with that. But the problem, from one aspect, is that it doesn't do enough for the unborn life. It doesn't in any way protect that, so that the pro-life people are on that side of the question. They're saying, but yes, what about the rights of the fetus? And how won't our culture sort of go downhill if we simply are aborting people right and left? And of course, there's a great insistence on that side of the argument that indeed the fetal life is potentially human, that we're dealing with something human here, not just tissue that can be sort of evacuated from the womb, the way the language is often used. But, well, I should get more precise with that, I guess, and that is that the problem in saying just that, it's a minimal kind of law, is that it doesn't seem to be minimal. It doesn't seem to be doing the minimal job for the unborn.
Yes, I acknowledge that, and I guess I was putting it in the broader context, Jim, of how we tend to become too legalistic in approaching these issues, and that we should be taking a broader view, and we shouldn't be trying to worry about what the absolute minimum is, nor should we be worrying about the maximum in terms of the pro-choice side of the argument. I think that, again, we have to put that in some kind of a moral context that suggests that there is some way to reconcile the pro-life and the pro-choice sides of the discussion.
Well, I know some people have said that the problem is that it gets into the courts at all. That once the courts have it, once you've got a judicial system deciding it, you get a definitive kind of answer, a yes or no kind of situation. That whereas if it's in the legislature, you end up more with compromise. In our own system, it's often said that no interest group ever loses everything, that usually legislators try to take into consideration somehow the rights or interests of particular minority groups. I'm not so sure if that always works out that way, but that there's more of a sense of compromise when something's in the legislature. At least that's the way some people argue it, that if indeed it was worked out on a state-by-state basis that way, that we wouldn't get, given our public opinion on the question, we wouldn't get a Roe versus Wade situation where there's nothing done in terms of protecting the very young fetal life in the first 3 months.
Well, and you're getting to the core of this concern about judicial activism over the last few years, wherein the judiciary is being criticized for being too active, when in fact, in a lot of minds' eyes, the judiciary is simply filling in where the legislature has failed to act. And you're absolutely right. It is the business, it is the charge, it is the job of the legislature to enact legislation, and they are by nature representative bodies in our democracy, and they should work out those kinds of difficult issues. It is up to the judiciary, of course, to simply interpret whatever the legislature passed by way of legislation. But you do raise a rather interesting question of why is it that this is now becoming such an important issue? I mean, it's not like we're not talking about something like computer software where we lawyers are agonizing over developing a new body of law to protect software.
No.
Or these high-tech areas, if you will. Life has been with us.
Yeah, but I think the difference is the technology now. You know, there's something like 1.5 million abortions in the United States in a given year. You know, in other words, we now have the ability to do this. The technology is there, the medical practice is there, the availability for people is there, certain funding available, and so on. So that I think that becomes, you know, part of the problem. It's such at a mass level, and many people of moral sensibility say that can't be. We can't countenance that. We have to fight against that kind of situation, and many will argue that, well, it will destroy the fabric of our society. And I think, you know, as people say, how much of a slippery slope are we on here? In other words, how much of a domino effect do we have? What real reason is there to say that, well, there would be amniocentesis, we'd find out Down syndrome with the baby, therefore there'd be an abortion? What really is the difference in saying at some point, well, the baby is born deformed, why can't we have infanticide now? You know, I don't know how you would argue clearly that you would put a limit on it somehow. It seems to me the respect for life has to be across the board, for unborn life and for old people as well. Otherwise, I don't know where you draw the line. Although I must say, in fairness, that some moralists do draw certain lines, and they will say that, well, there does seem, if you take what happens with the fertilized ovum in the first 8 or 9 days, I think it is, I'm a little foggy on this, but that you have, very often you have, the conservative estimate I think is 50% of the fertilized ova don't implant, for example. In those first days you can have the twinning process. And you have such a tiny bit of material here, matter, that some people will say, well, you can't just say that that tiny bit of matter in the first 8 or 9 days has the same rights as a functioning human being. In other words, I do think that it does seem possible to say that there is a developmental scale here, and that maybe you can't exactly impute the same rights to the human person in those first 8 or 9 days. At least I'm saying some moralists talk like that. They will make distinctions. Seems to me, my own opinion is that the first idea has to be respect for all life, and that's fundamental and rock bottom. And then if you're on the top of that, if you're going to maybe start to make some distinctions, I think that does seem legitimate. Just as at the end of life, if someone is totally comatose and their brain no longer functions at all, and therefore they can't function as a person, then we say we don't have to use extraordinary means to keep them alive. You wouldn't have to use the kind of means that you should use with a normal functioning person who you can bring back to normal health by the use of these means. So I guess a general feeling I have is that both sides on this argument have not been willing to nuance their positions at all. Because the feeling is if we do give in a little bit here, the pro-life people are saying, we give in a little bit, like even the kind of things I'm saying here, then the other side will jump on it. We've got to have a firm kind of total stand. And the pro-choice people seem to be saying, well, if we even begin to talk about fetal life, how we consider it will be playing into their hands. I've read a lot of their literature. They never mention that. There's nothing said in there at all about their own perception of the fetus. How do they think of it? They don't even want to raise the question because they want to be absolute, it seems to me, and protect their position. And the pro-life people, I think, are in danger of the same thing.
It's been a highly charged issue, and the act-react syndrome has been very much alive and well, I think, in this entire dialogue. And I think, as you suggest, it is difficult to even characterize it as a dialogue in that there has not been anything by way of any serious negotiation, and the legislative effort is going to continue to be a very difficult one to mount until such time as the pro-choice and the pro-life folks start to take take into consideration some modification of their position to try to get to something that a legislator could act upon, or that he could introduce as some kind of legislation that could in time find its way into the courts and thence be refined to the point where we can accommodate the high-tech, the technology as it comes down. Now, that then suggests to me another part of that issue, Jim, and that is, even with people as close as my own father, who passed away in 1954, I'm sure from something that would not have taken his life had it occurred today. And we see this sort of increase in technology, and as you say, we probably have the number of abortions in the United States today only because the technology exists. We can continue people on who might otherwise die only because the technology exists. So that if that be the situation, we know that there's going to be increased technology as the days, if not the hours, and the weeks and the months and the years go by. And we're going to continue to find these situations. For example, the genetic engineering issue, which is a whole other issue, and the whole super race issue. But it seems that in getting at the abortion issue, in getting at the pro-choice vis-a-vis pro-life issue, that we need to do something that's going to hold us in pretty good stead for a fair amount of increased technology over the months and years ahead. And I don't see that kind of rational dialogue.
No, we really don't have a good dialogue going. One of the Hatch Amendment, as it's called, has been sponsored by the United States bishops, not sponsored but supported by it. And really what that amendment wants to do is to say that a right to abortion is not secured by the Constitution. The Congress and the several states shall have the concurrent power to restrict and prohibit abortions. I guess the reason for backing that amendment is to get it back into the states, where perhaps there's greater debate and something that can be done with that. That may be one way of thinking about it. I think many people who back that, well, I think they do think of it as a simpler kind of solution to some of the other approaches to dealing with the problem that would just simply, by law, prohibit all abortions. When you move in that direction and say, we want to prohibit all abortions, the problem from the legal viewpoint, it seems to me, is that it's not enforceable. That if we did get a law in the books tomorrow, we'd have something comparable to prohibition, only with the stakes immeasurably raised. We would probably have people going against the laws in that way. We would have a lot of the return to the abortion mills, I guess, or they're always the back alley kind of thing. In other words, people would be violating the law. I mean, I think what the pro-life side has to realize is that there are good people of conscience, who simply don't see our argument. They don't see our respect for that fetal life. I think of somebody like Robert McAfee Brown, a Protestant theologian who has a tremendous record on human rights and trying to help people, and a charitable person, all of that, a good thinker. And he is really on this pro-choice side. And he's just insistent on the rights of the women to their own bodies. Well, I don't know if he uses that language, but he sees it as partly a feminist issue, that women are the ones who are pregnant, and they're the ones who face the problem directly, and that we can't somehow abridge their rights and so on. But the point is that Robert McAfee Brown represents a lot of people of goodwill who simply can't see it our way. And therefore, how are we going to legislate this? How are the pro-life people going to make a law that prohibits all abortions? It won't work. Practically, the society won't tolerate it. People will break it. And that will end up reducing, I think, the respect for the law, and will end up, I think, putting us in a bad position.
Well, and that's the sense I have for the whole issue at this point, is that it's premature. It's not unlike that difficult thing to teach children to recognize, and that is the question that should not be asked. Oftentimes it's not the right time to ask certain questions, and obviously there are other questions that should never be asked, but I pick up on your notion of prohibition and what has been, certainly in some circles, raging of late, the drug issue, whether to legalize drugs or not, what to do about marijuana, what to do about these other substances and these other chemicals. Well, we all see how much luck we've had with booze. It's an absolute mess, and we're just killing one another left and right. And there's some fascinating statistics about the number of people we kill in a year in automobiles due to drinking compared to the people that we killed in Vietnam over a 10-year period, and all those other statistics that we've all seen and heard. And then that comes forward into the drug issue, and it seems to me that there were a lot of us that were trying very hard to deal with the drug issue before we really understood what the drugs were all about, before we fully understood what marijuana could do over a period of time if ingested with any regularity, as well as some honest mistakes that I think were made by some people who advocated what seemed to be some rather ludicrous positions to others. And I have that same sense about the abortion issue, that it is so hot, that it is so emotional, that there's not an adequate dialogue. Like you say, they're not listening to each other. And it is, at the present time, a question that should not be asked of the courts. I'm not too sure it's a question that's ripe for the legislature yet. I think it's one of those that needs to bubble up, if you will, through society. It has to come up through some serious dialogue. It has to come up through some moral leaders, from some theologians. Let some people who deal with these kinds of difficult issues lead the discussion, and then develop some sense for what ought to be done that we as individuals can latch on to. And
I think the problem is, of course, that the dialogue isn't going on, as we suggest. You got hard and fast positions, and neither side is willing to sort of look at their own position and refine it in some sense. And I understand that from the ardent pro-life people. They're saying all these human beings are being killed, 1.5 million in the United States. I've got to fight against this, and I grant them that. And we ought to be happy there's people with conviction around. I think, as long as they don't firebomb abortion clinics, which I don't think makes a lot of sense, and so on. But on the other hand, those of us who maybe think of ourselves as liberal Christian people or work out of a contemporary framework, I think could play a constructive role here, and by saying the kind of things that I'm trying to bring out here. One, on the pro-choice side, that these people must begin to face the fact of what's the quality of fetal life. Can we just destroy fetuses without any moral implications of that? And they must begin to face that themselves. I find it interesting that in the left, the literature of the democratic socialist organizations and so on, I find a crack there. I find people beginning to ask these moral questions among themselves a little bit. I find that to be sort of a favorable sign here, to begin to raise the moral questions and not just keep saying over and over individual rights, freedom to women, and so on. What about the others? And on the pro-life side, it seems to me that we would need to raise this question of possibility, of what realistically can be done, and what kind of compromise are we willing to make. One author suggested something like going after a situation where state legislatures would prohibit abortions in the first 2 months, something like that, and that after that there would be freedom. He claims that would cut out about half the abortions that occur in the United States. But I mean, there's a person beginning to think maybe about compromise. But as you suggested, Bruce, the abortion issue is so heated up and so difficult, and here we are on the 10th anniversary Supreme Court decision, Roe versus Wade. Many of us who have a pro-life leaning are unhappy with that decision and feel that something needs to be done about it. But surely part of it is to work at this business of dialogue and to do it in a reasonable way.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Bruce Kramer, a lawyer practicing in the city of Toledo. The topic of this week's Reflections was the legal aspects of the abortion question. If you have any questions about today's program or any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections in care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio, 43623. Produced in the studios of WLQR, Reflections is directed by Mary Beth Kirchner. Reflections is brought to you by the Genesis Radio Network.